Hello and welcome to the latest installment of Helix Education's webinar series on COVID-19, the roadmap to fall 2020. Today, we're talking about online student experience and engagement, and specifically, we're talking about a culture of coaching. Thanks to everybody who's joined us today. My name is Sparky Mortimer. I'm the Associate Director of Creative Strategy here at Helix Education, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. Before we get into things, just going over a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you've been with us for previous webinars, you know how the routine goes. But if you haven't, just a couple of things to keep in mind. We are recording this webinar, and it'll be available on our Helix Education YouTube channel. We'll also be sending out a link to all of you who have attended. And so in addition to recording, we also have a live transcript of this webinar through a service called Otter AI. And so if you look in the chat, you will find a link to that live transcript if that's a service that you'd like to take advantage of. We will have a Q&A portion of the webinar toward the end of today's proceedings. And so at any time during the webinar, you can click that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and submit your question. We've already gotten a few questions ahead of time, so thanks to everybody who has already contributed questions. And again, you can do that at any time using the Q&A function there. If you're having any technical difficulties or stuff like that, please utilize the chat for that. Any other questions about what you're seeing and hearing, use that Q&A function. And so, like I said, this is the latest installment in our series. If you've been with us for our journey to fall 2020, we're pretty far down the road here, as you can see. We're going to go a little bit more detailed toward the end of today's session in terms of what these different pillars are and why we're on the roadmap that we're on and how we're going to touch on these different areas each week. But for this week, the week of June 15th, we are focused on online student experience and engagement. And I could think of a few people more qualified to talk about this topic than our presenter today, Miranda Benson, Vice President of Enrollment Management at Helix Education. 14 exciting years. And when she says exciting, that's an understatement. Absolutely. Miranda is incredibly skilled at engaging with non-traditional adult students and helping them to achieve quality outcomes online. I've worked with her for many years. She is a great leader. Her teams are always high performing, whether it's admissions, enrollment, success coaching, academic coaching, which we'll get into today. Miranda is a naturally gifted leader and a very driven person. And so I've been fortunate to work with her the last 5 years at Helix as we work together to deliver enrollment growth for our partners. And the foundation of that absolutely is this culture of coaching. And so Miranda, I'm going to turn the time over to you to get into that topic and help our attendees understand why a culture of coaching matters. So Miranda, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sparky. And thank you again, everyone, for taking the time to be present and engaged in our 7th webinar from Helix Education. I'm really thrilled to be here today, mainly because we get to talk about something that I'm incredibly passionate about, which is coaching. So a few weeks back, you might remember that Sharon Hopez, our Chief Academic Officer, teamed up with Dr. Brian Burke from Murray State, and they discussed the role that student affairs plays in this ever-changing landscape of higher education. And they discussed how to bridge that gap in supporting online students with faculty and with student affairs staff to overall improve retention. So the goals of today's discussion are really to explore the fundamental components of coaching and why it's so vital to get this recipe right in today's environment. Many universities are offering tremendous, incredible facets of student support, and we hope that today's discussion will lead a dialogue with your institution about how you can extend this further. We want you to walk away from today with an understanding about how to transition from the foundations to a culture of coaching, and that your students will experience connection and support and resources in every interaction with your team members. Hopefully this will become a bonus and an add-on as a result of attending your university and graduating from your university. And as a result, we hope that you get a chance to step back and process some of the insight that we share with you today. And in our future webinars, you'll get to be a part of where we talk about strategies and tactics that support effective recruiting and retention strategies to drive enrollment growth. So let's talk about our agenda. So first, we are going to explore what coaching really is, and why our students need it. I have to start with saying that every time I start a dialogue about coaching, I think to myself, is this too simplistic? Maybe I feel like everyone should know that providing excellent student service is important, and that the student engagement and experience that happens outside of the classroom is just as important as the experience inside the classroom. But then I ask myself, what are the students saying? So the first thing we're going to cover today is recent survey data that'll give us insight into what our students are currently experiencing in higher education, and specifically what they are experiencing in this current environment with an emergency transition to remote learning as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to discuss how these survey results directly support the need for coaching and how it helps your institution connect the dots for students, and specifically those students that are at high risk and need additional support and resources. The last thing that we'll talk about is, how does this become a thing? How do you go from consultation on coaching and then training your teams on these behaviors and skill sets to actually having it become a part of your institution's DNA? And then the super fun part for me is that you get to ask some questions and we can really have the conversation and the meat and potatoes around coaching. So back to that one simple question, which is, what are the students saying? So as you can imagine, everyone in the higher education space has been really eager to get a pulse on how students are being impacted in order to predict what's going to happen for fall, and also an attempt to be prescriptive in the resources that we provide for students. So to date, there's been a handful of student surveys ranging from 500 student participants to 25,000 student participants, with varying core intentions around why they were collecting that data. So some were trying to get an idea of whether students were going to be coming back in fall. Some were trying to tap into the needs that they had for remote education. And some were just trying to figure out how to engage these students in this environment. But regardless of the overarching intent, the aggregated data really gave us some good insight into the students' concerns, which in some cases is not very surprising. So students were answering, yes, they are struggling with time management and homeschooling their children and learning and working remotely. And yes, mental and emotional health are getting in the way of their distance learning. Yes, they are absolutely concerned about being able to pay for their education. And yes, they are absolutely questioning whether the online experience is actually worth the bill that they're getting. As we might assume, survey data from HEED's consortium, which surveyed 20,000 students over about 40 institutions, showed that students that have less privileged identities, backgrounds, and experiences are all experiencing the stresses and worries about COVID-19 even more acutely. So what many institutions will say is that they absolutely have mental health services available to students, and that they absolutely have support and resources around time management, and that they send detailed information about financial aid and resources and award letters out to their students, and might even have flexible payment arrangements. And lastly, I think that many would say that their online offerings have the same rigor and academic quality as that of their ground classes. But the resounding feedback from students is that those resources are getting lost in translation. So despite the email engagement, the newsletters, the glowing signs pointing to the resources on the EDU site, it is just not reaching our students. So further support of the idea that we have a lot of work to do in student experience and engagement is this student experience snapshot from Brightspot. And it demonstrates that of all the various facets of the student experience that reside outside of the classroom, academic services and non-academic services are areas where students say that they're having they're least likely to be having a very good experience, and in some cases may be more likely to be having a very poor experience. The good news, the silver lining, if you will, is that most universities have expressed an intention to do something. And as you can see here, the #1 strategy is to increase advising outreach. So it's clear that institutions have aligned on this fundamental truth that what students need right now is human connection, human to human connection, and engagement from a trusted advisor. So in fact, what you see on the top 3 resources that institutions plan to offer leading up to fall, it's really about soft skills and services that help students navigate this really intense environment. And that's incredibly, incredibly important because based on this survey data, academic engagement, mental health support, financial guidance, and academic support are the 4 areas that are screaming for attention. So in the previous webinars, my good friend and colleague, Dr. Sharon Hoppes, has detailed the need to provide an engaging academic experience in the online classroom. And this is especially important as the student feedback is telling us that they just did not have a great experience in spring. But students are also craving that same engagement and resources outside of the classroom. We know that mental health impacts the academic experience. And while many institutions have resources, therapy, and counseling services available, sometimes for free, it's really important that the students have positive relationships and the trust to ask for more information on that service. Students are gravely concerned about finances, and in some cases, they have been impacted financially as a result of the pandemic, or their parents who are paying their tuition bill have been impacted. And so in this scenario, an emailed award letter with maybe a list of resources just might not suffice in making that student feel confident about their finances leading up to fall. So it may take a one-on-one appointment scheduled for a half an hour with a financial aid counselor preceding the start to really help the student understand the big picture and make sure that they can commit to it. Lastly, academic support is vital. No matter how much you improve the online course, your team has to remove barriers to success. So your coaching team has to be the voice in the student's ear, giving them options about how to push past those obstacles, how to plan and replan their future, and really to be the connection to all of the resources that your university provides as a part of the tuition. And many institutions are on board with this and are implementing creative ways to integrate coaching into their process. So I know Baylor back in April rolled out a bear coaching program, and they spent countless hours leading up to it, but they had several hundred university staff volunteer to be coaches. And so after they were trained, they sent out a survey to students, and any student that selected that they were struggling in their coursework or with their education and or expressed the desire to have a coach, these coaches reached out to them. So we do have some folks in universities getting on board with coaching and finding creative ways to implement it. What are the fundamentals of coaching? So in a previous webinar, the lovely Kari Kovar, our Chief Operating Officer, spoke about the importance of having a robust engagement and communication strategy. But what is the difference between calling and texting and emailing as these very transactional interactions versus coaching as a transformational experience? One example that we like to use to give context and color about how we approach coaching is that of being a personal trainer. So let's say tomorrow you decide that you want to start utilizing a gym and start working out and training those muscles. So you have the people that you walk in and you see them at the front desk, and they are usually incredibly polite and helpful, and they can answer questions about the equipment in some cases, hand you a towel, get you checked in. The gym itself is probably going to send you some emails to keep you connected and engaged. And if you quit your membership, they are absolutely going to try and re-engage you. But if you commit to a personal trainer, it's a much more holistic experience. So in the first training session, they're going to sit you down. They're going to talk about your goals first and foremost. They're going to talk about their approach. And they're probably going to customize the workouts and the number of sessions to what's appropriate based on the goals that you have. And so they might pull in other resources, maybe a nutritionist. They might have you working with some apps that help you track your progress. And probably most importantly, if you were to kind of get into a slump and maybe start not showing up for those sessions, they're going to have a human-to-human conversation with you and try to reconnect and re-inspire you to get back on track. So when we think about how much more effective personal training can be for many folks, especially if they're new to working out or have challenges around fitness, we can apply those same tactics to new or at-risk students. So when you're taking the time to listen to your current recruiters or advisors, you might find that many interactions might be focused around that next task, so very transactional, like we spoke about. They might be helping them with completing or how to complete that task. And so you also might find that in situations where students are escalated or you feel like less than stellar student service is offered, it's situations where your team members might have been reactive, right, to the student scenario. And in some cases, maybe the staff member and the student might be overwhelmed. They might be potentially flustered. And really, they feel pressured to make the easiest decision the fastest. So the first component of our coaching foundation teaches us to slow it down, right? We're taught to see the student instead of the scenario. And each student will bring their own experience with them into their degree program, which means they're going to have their own learning experience. The goal for our coaches is to have a proactive approach to be supportive to the students through life coaching, academic coaching, and career coaching. And then they set those expectations in their very first coaching session with the new student. Now, typically recruiters and academic advisors are incredibly comfortable with basic academic coaching, but can really struggle to make eye contact with tough conversations that happen outside of that wheelhouse, right? But we all know that life and career impact our students academically, so we absolutely must lean into those conversations. And what that typically might look like is a coach might be providing some life coaching when a student mentions that they're going through a divorce and have concerns about managing the stress in their coursework. A coach might provide some academic coaching to a student who's considered changing their major at a really pivotal point in their degree program. And a coach might be drawing a parallel between how a student might implement some of the strategies that they've learned in their leadership course in their new position at work. The question that we've got to ask ourselves as leaders is, are we concerned about the level, if we're concerned about the level of transaction that we're hearing in the day-to-day interactions, and we want more of these coaching foundations from our staff members, have we truly trained them to be proactive in these scenarios? Or have we ourselves focused quite a bit on the process? So our RISE model is the way that we focus on the coaching element of the conversation. So we use the mnemonic RISE, which is the coaching approach we aim to use in each and every one of our coaching interactions with prospective and current students. The 4 components of RISE include building rapport, inquiring, supporting, and empowering our students. So let's dive into that a bit, beginning with rapport. In order to build any positive, productive coaching relationship, it's really important to establish a strong connection with our students from day one. So one of the questions we ask our coaches to ask themselves in the process of building these relationships are, what are the common interests that we share? The key idea of coaching is to connect and build rapport with a diverse range of student personalities, experiences, and backgrounds. And one good gauge that we're doing that well is when we see students opening up and elaborating on their experience in classes, or sharing feedback on the survey that their coach has been really helpful. And probably the most important sign is that our students are continuing to show up for their coaching sessions and be present. So One of the signs that I kind of laugh about that when I know things are going well and our teams are doing a good job of building rapport is the amount of laughter we just hear collectively that happens between students and coaches. And I know that sounds really simple, but it just really is a good way to gauge success in this area. Next up, we have inquiry, which we define as asking powerful questions to learn more about your student and how to help him or her be successful. So with our teams, it's super easy to spot a coach a mile away. Coaches are constantly asking questions. They're very curious people. They're people for sure, and love learning about others. But the process of inquiring is more about gathering, is more than just gathering information, right? So asking our students powerful, open-ended, thought-provoking questions really promote self-discovery and self-awareness on the student's part. And so this is a really important step in the students in the coaching and student process, especially because many of the students are learning about how to be a student for the very first time. And so we encourage our coaches to focus on 6 areas in their inquiry, which include academics, grades, GPA, those kind of things, effectiveness. So how prepared are they overall for their classes? And then what are their study habits? Motivation. So what is the core goal and how does this degree fit into it? Their life balance, their commitment overall to each of their academic goals, and then finally, their financial preparedness and understanding of this investment. And then there's another critical piece, which is support. So obviously, the amount of support and outreach necessary varies from student to student. For example, students in their first year tend to want and need guidance on a more frequent basis, and grad students and students that are further along usually less. But oftentimes the difference between coaching and maybe a typical advisor is really about accountability. So coaches are holding their students accountable on a weekly basis to make sure that they're on track, that they're motivated, and that they're aware of their own progress. One of the first things our coaches do to establish accountability in their coaching session is to set an expectation of what the coaching relationship looks like. So how often the coach and the student will meet, what they will cover. And this is as simple as just a time and date appointment for every single coaching session that both the coach and the student are committed to. So by being proactive and actively building the relationship with the student from the beginning, the coach has this ability to help the student navigate little fires before they become really big fires. And as a result, this helps the student earn little wins and build the confidence that we all know is necessary for them to graduate. So supporting our students is coaching through those moments that could have been a dropped class, that could have been missed attendance, or a failed assignment, but our coach helped the student push through for the win. And then finally, we have Empower, which is all about action plans as prioritized lists that measure incremental progress towards the student's goals. So this is the stage of the interaction where we encourage the student to fly. In many cases, there's lots of resources that are comprehensive enough that have their own designated expert that is not the coach. So that might be a career center or mental health services. And it's really just the role of the coach to know enough about the service to encourage utilization of that resource and then connect the student to that expert in the most warmest, inviting way possible, right? And so ultimately, empowerment encompasses getting the right tools into the student's hands at the right time and then inspiring the student to use them. Another aspect of our coaching culture is how we handle the inevitable obstacles that students will encounter during their academic journey. Again, when a student calls who is escalated or wants to drop a class, we want to focus our coaching efforts away from that very transactional process or issue and guide the student as a learner through an effective problem-solving process. So again, we have another mnemonic F.E.E.D. We love mnemonics here at Helix. It helps us remember the important steps to cover in an academic, what we call detour, which is facts, explore, evaluate, and then decide. So in fact, we are just covering all of the details about this detour. We temp check, we're trying to find out how the student's feeling. We want to know all of the facts of the situation. We're often using tell me more phrases to further develop this situation, and then we're summarizing. So we can make sure that the student and the coach is on the same page and that we are aligned in understanding the problem. Next, we explore. So we're sharing empathy with the student. We're making them feel heard and understood and de-escalating. And so really this phase is about bringing up this whiteboard of options for students so that they understand that there's not only one way to solve this problem, that there are many, and we get to kind of explore and make sure that we understand everything that's available to us. We kind of go down the road of each option and we see where it's going to land and how that fits in with the student's overall initial motivation for earning their degree. We evaluate next. So this is just all about crossing off options, understanding the pros and cons, and really digging in deep to find out why a particular option is not going to be the right fit for a student. And lastly, we decide. So ultimately, the decision is all up to the student, and it is our job from a coaching perspective to help support the student and engage them through their next step. Aside from all of this one-on-one coaching, which is pretty in-depth, your coach can help guide your student in the right direction for other resources and can actually check back in with them to make sure that they've utilized them. So in addition to your email, text, direct mail cadence that might initially familiarize your student with these resources, your coach can act as a conduit to making sure your students are truly aware of all the tools in their toolbox and they're actually using them. So it's not uncommon for me to hear coaches following up with students on their plans to maybe speak with Career Guidance Center to figure out potential job options, or making sure that they were able to connect with the financial aid office about their award and they truly understand it. The really cool thing about this process is that the follow-up and gained insight into the student's experience with that resource actually acts as a feedback loop and a feedback channel. So then you can find out what's working and not working within that particular resource. It also helps build the coach's expertise in all of that resource is comprised of. So now the coach knows how truly effective this resource can be for students, and then is sharing that with students as they encounter future detours. So again, many universities provide such amazing resources and tools as a part of their community and network. The coach does not replace those resources. Boundaries are incredibly important. But because of the fantastic relationship that coaches build through the RISE process, they're able to make sure that your students are taking advantage of the resources, and that ultimately contributes to the students' academic progress and success. So those are the three main components that coaching is comprised of. However, making sure that coaching is implemented is much more than 1 3-hour training. So developing those coaching skills requires a series of trainings that breaks down each skill set for your coaches, talks about why that skill set and the following behaviors influence students. Talk about how to actually implement that with role play and practice and scenarios. So equally important are the resources that you develop for your coaches. You would be surprised how many times I've seen amazing content in the trainings, but that knowledge is locked away in one individual. And then that person is burdened with all the trainings for all the new people that come on board. But even worse, when that person decides to take on a new opportunity, it can often be like a crisis mode for the institution when they're trying to digest all of this information and process and training prior to that team member departing. So creating an intranet and making sure that you're thoroughly documenting the process and the training materials is a must in making sure that your expectations around the coaching is implemented. One unpopular truth I think about student service, and actually probably service in general, is that our default, especially over time, is transaction. So we should absolutely do our best to hire naturally curious and helpful people, but it's always going to take leadership and practice and vigilance to make sure that this becomes a part of the culture. So now you've trained your staff on RISE, on the FEED process, on the coaching fundamentals. You've developed resources to support your resource. We should be done here, right? The webinar is over. No, it's not. So this is truly just a starting point for developing your coaching culture. The true work really begins in your leadership around coaching. So in order to provide excellent student service, you as a leader must be unflinchingly passionate about coaching. And you might be in a scenario where you don't have a coach position and you might not have the resources right now to allocate one. And that might be a super fair statement in your scenario. But while tricky to not have a coach position, you can still set an expectation of coaching culture with your team members until it's actually a viable option to add a coaching role to your team. One of the hardest times I would say to manage around student service might be when we're having the most success, our highest enrolling months, and our busiest moments. But we really have to prioritize our value around the student experience and engagement, because we know that our results will follow. We'll have higher conversion, we'll have higher enrollments, and it will impact positively our retention measures. So we really have to hold space in each day to make sure that we're examining the student experience. So either through observation, face-to-face, watching your team members interact with students, or by call recording. One other way, obviously, is surveys. So one strategy that we found that's incredibly helpful in inserting the human element is we have members of our quality assurance team actually outreach and perform phone calls to students during their first course and beyond to ask questions about the experience, and then they can ask additional developmental probes to identify areas of concern. So your leader should absolutely be conducting observations and providing feedback about the level of service that your team is providing students. And this has to happen frequently and consistently. I remember early in my career, I had just heard the term cyclical coaching. And that as leaders, we shouldn't have to cyclically coach our team. And so if team members weren't implementing, then it might be time for disciplinary action. And so one day I was super frustrated and I went to one of my favorite leaders of all time and I asked him, when does it ever get through? So when will I stop having to coach on rapport and how to ask provoking questions and making sure to set a time and date appointment? And at the time, he just simply responded, never. What I realized is that part of excellence is understanding that as a leader, you are always working against the default of mediocrity. And so while you absolutely may and should have non-negotiables that require a more formal accountability process if not followed, coaching as a culture requires follow-up constantly, never-ending vigilance, consistency, and passion. And so as a last thought on this topic, I think one of the most vital components of the coaching culture to be role modeling for your team. So when employees feel heard and have a good relationship with their leaders and team members, and your institution demonstrates a vested interest in the employee's experience, that is passed on to your students. So our RISE management training mirrors our RISE coach training so that all of the team members feel that coaching is not something that happens in just one job description or in one specific student interaction, but it's what we do across the entire organization. And one of the amazing byproducts of coaching is that it really becomes a part of the learning experience for your students. So they take that on to future career opportunities and professional experiences. So overall, today we learned about what needs our students are expressing, how coaching looks and sounds, how you maintain a coaching culture through engaged leadership. And so hopefully today, when you leave, this webinar helped you identify some of those important questions. Are you handing over the towel at the gym, or are your teams training their students? Is there prioritization around gauging the experience of your students? So now it's your turn to ask me some questions.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Miranda, for everything you shared so far. We've already gotten a few questions. If you joined us a little bit late, that's just fine. Use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type in your question. We've already got a handful. So Miranda, I'm just gonna jump right in.
Yeah.
Prior to the webinar, we had a question submitted by Twyla, and Twyla asked, how should community colleges who are non-residential best maximize relationship building with students? So Miranda, how would you answer Twyla's question?
Yeah, so I think that is, I think it's very tough, right? Because part of your ability to build relationships with people is seeing them all the time. And so in the cases with community colleges, sometimes what the challenge can be is that disconnect of not seeing students, having kind of a transient culture might be one of the challenges in terms of community college. And what I would say is just starting with the basics of the RISE model and really making sure that each department, even if you don't have that coaching role specifically, making sure that each department really has a connection to making sure that they understand all of the students' needs and concerns, and that if they can't answer that question, that they are making sure to be warm and connecting to the next expert that can. And so really it's just about building that relationship through amazing student service, even when these students aren't students that you see every day.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Miranda, and thanks, Twyla, for that question. Yeah. We had a question come in from Cherie. Cherie asked, how much do you adhere to ICF coaching competencies, as well as hiring those individuals who maybe are ICF trained? Miranda, I'll let you speak to that one.
Yeah, sure. So our coaches are not ICF trained. I would say that the big picture of all of this is, and I think a lot of the coaching standards can differ from different from different certification to different certification. I would say that the biggest piece of making sure that your students are getting good service is making sure that you are auditing and that you are connecting to what your coaches are doing on the phone. I know that I've worked with some coaches that ultimately have received amazing training and have received certification, but ultimately in practice that's thrown out the window quite a bit. And I would say the important thing in terms of any certification is just making sure that you're setting boundaries. And so most of our coaches are aligned with either recruiting or academic advising. We very much like to keep them as a primary in those roles, and that coaching is a culture for us versus a certification.
Got it. And I think that helps address Holly's question too. She also mentions international coaching federations and this idea of academic coaches being credibly credentialed. So any other perspectives on that in terms of credentialing and standards and that sort of thing that you haven't already addressed?
I would say that there are some tremendous programs out there, and I would say that if that is the right step for your institution to have those credentials, and especially when you are maybe you are employing or working with teams that have to work very independently, and maybe if your resources are limited and so you don't have necessarily as much bandwidth to support additional coaches or responsibilities, that might be a great place to start. But I would ultimately say that even in addition to any certification or credential that you offer, it's incredibly important to make sure that as leaders you are surveying and auditing the student experience, to not just depend on that credential to see you through.
Okay. Excellent. Cherie and Holly, thanks for those questions. I've got a question from Eduardo in the chat. He asks, as an instructor, I'm concerned academic coaching may become less effective if I'm also engaged in life and career coaching. How would you recommend establishing boundaries between all three types of coaching without being perceived as non-responsive by students? And so kind of maybe spreading yourself a little too thin or running the risk of maybe something like that. So Miranda, what would you say to Eduardo in that case?
Yeah, so I would say that I totally understand bandwidth, and that is a challenge for, I would say, a lot of institutions, because when you're worrying about how to cover all of these various topics, obviously really critical mistakes could happen, like students being in the wrong classes or things like that. So what I would say is that really this is a time to kind of prioritize. This is not necessarily about offering the same amount of outreach and the same amount of resources to all students. One thing that we have implemented here with Helix is we identify risk with our students. So we are looking at amount of credits completed, GPA. We are looking at courses, their current courses and grades in classes. We are looking at things like academic probation. And we are establishing which students really need us the most and need that week-to-week outreach, and especially considering even programs. So what I would suggest is that you really take a look at what your student population is and really try to identify and prioritize what outreach those students need. And then you don't feel like you have to extend this to every single student. What we talk about with the teams are that there are students that will struggle and may ultimately fail their courses, really no matter how much work and effort we put into supporting them. There are students that will do phenomenal and you know, at some points even sound annoyed when we call them, right? Because they are going to do great in their classes no matter how much coaching support they get. And so the students that we're actually trying to touch and connect with are the students in the middle. And so so ultimately, again, I would just focus on prioritizing and ultimately really tapping into what your students seem to need the most, versus feeling like you have to, you know, say in the session, oh, now we're going to do life coaching. Tell me what's going on in your life. Your students will really kind of speak to their needs and tell you what they need. And really, it is just your role to meet those needs.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Miranda. Eduardo, hopefully that that gives you a good answer. I got a question from Rita here. She asked, how do you differentiate coach, training, faculty, and staff who are part-time and adjunct? So Miranda, what would you suggest for Rita?
Can you repeat that question for me, Sparky, just so I understand?
Yeah, so it says, how do you differentiate coach, training, faculty, and staff who are part-time and adjunct? So maybe training part-time faculty and staff on this idea of coaching.
Mm-hmm. So I would say again, right? This is not necessarily what we're not putting on the table is everyone needs to take on an additional 20 hours to really coach students and be available to have, you know, 1 hour dialogues with each student, right? So ultimately, it's really just about providing great service to students in whatever area that you're in. So if you are a part-time faculty member, you might not necessarily extend as much into the recruiting process or as maybe a recruiter would, right? But what you're going to do is make sure that you take the time to understand how the student is feeling about their specific course that they're in right now with you, right? And what were some of the things that they struggled with a bit on the assignment. And again, even using the F.E.E.D process for a faculty member. So if you get a student and they say, I want to drop this course, and maybe your institution doesn't necessarily have a team that can support and help you in the scenarios where a student wants to drop, it might be using the F.E.E.D process and talking to the student about those different options and talking about how they map out, right? With a level of empathy and with the level of care. So this is about implementing the coaching tactics even in your wheelhouse, and not necessarily having to extend out and do other people's positions.
All right, thanks, Miranda. And Rita, thanks for the question. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah.
I got a question from Prudvi in the chat. Prudvi asked, can you please explain the difference between coaching and mentoring? I think that's an important distinction to make. So Miranda,
yeah, I love that. Well, I hope that there's always some level of mentoring in the coaching position. I would say that the big difference between the two is that ultimately a mentor is really kind of paving the way through a shared experience about maybe steps that a student should take in their kind of roadmap on their academic progression. And so our coaches might not have necessarily made those same, or might not be on that same path, right? And I would say the big piece is the coaches are really helping to kind of be that centerpiece for all of the resources within an institution, well, where the mentor is really about kind of paving the path and then giving advice to that student on what they can take as a next step. And I wonder if the path might even be a bit more specified in terms of help and resource in a mentor relationship than a coaching relationship. But really good thought. I like that.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Prudvi, for that question. Donna, I see your question about resources for coaches for online students, and we are going to talk about lots of different resources available that Helix Education has made available, and so we will get to that. So that'll be after our Q&A, but yes, we're going to share where you can find those resources, how you can download those and take advantage of those. We got time for a couple more questions, so if you haven't already, feel free to submit. Miranda, I think the next question that I have for you is, how do you handle staff that are just resistant to change and you know, are resistant to wanting to give student service, or like we said, I don't have time, or this is another thing to add to my plate? How do you address that resistance that might come?
Yeah, that is really, really, I mean, as leaders, right? That's the question. What I would say, and we have absolutely had instances that I've had instances of that in my past leadership with past organizations. And of course, you constantly experience that as a leader. What I would say is that that could be a whole new webinar, right? You know, how to manage through change and have a culture of change. But what I would say is that the first piece is really, again, role modeling and setting that expectation. In some cases, it's very interesting because we have, you know, increased outreach to our students in certain scenarios. And sometimes the coaches will come back and say, the students say they don't like it. We're calling too much. And the very first thing that we coach and we look for is how well we set the expectation in the very beginning of what that relationship looks like, because it's all relative, right? And so when students know that they will get a call every week, they will have a time and date appointment, and they will be having conversations around certain content that's really, really important to them, students generally don't then complain about the contact that happens. But when they don't know and the calls are not filled with value and content that is relative and helpful to them, then they often complain. And I would say, again, I always then say, let's role model that. And so ultimately, I would say first, are we starting with the expectation of what it looks like to be a team member on this team and in this organization, where we are open to change and that things will change, and that this is why the change is happening, and really stepping back and making sure that team members see the value in really good student service and take pride in what they are offering and creating. So that's one. The other piece of that is that it might be helpful to take an entire step back and do some limited belief training. So we do that with all of our team members walking in the door. We try not to make any assumption of what our team members might have experienced prior to working with Helix. And so we do a self-coaching training where we really challenge limited beliefs, and we help our team members see that sometimes when we're resistant to a certain change, it might not be tied to necessarily anything legitimate about it, but it might just be overall the way that we think about things and then how we process them and how then certain behaviors follow from that. So I would absolutely suggest that if you are concerned about that, that you start looking at your team and questioning whether a limited belief training might be helpful before you roll out some of these other more thorough and coaching specific trainings.
Okay, excellent. So just kind of piggybacking off that idea of limited belief, Kate has a question. This idea of a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. You probably heard those terms as well. And so is that a similar kind of idea in terms of that limited belief training is helping to develop more of a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the cool things that we do that I don't know, appeals to me, I think sometimes, you know, we can talk about these things really big picture, right? Fixed growth set or fixed mindset versus growth mindset. And sometimes it doesn't connect to our team members until we actually have these conversations and make them very personal. So what we do in our training is we actually kind of make it more personal. Sometimes we'll have some professional examples, but we encourage our team members to talk about things that are causing them issue, causing them internal heartburn. And we trace that back to the specific thoughts that the team member is having. And then we push on them about it. So we say, is this a true thought? Is this actually provable in a court of law? And a lot of times it's not. And so then we work with our team members on crossing out that thought. And it's actually really literal. It's on whiteboards around here. And we cross out that thought and then replace it with something that's true and believable. And so with working with our team members on this, we actually then and not only does it help them personally, which I'm very passionate about helping our team members personally, but obviously just like with coaching and students, it flows through professional work, right? So what I like about that versus the theory of fixed and growth mindset is that it really shows that in actual live, right? Like they get to see the thoughts that are kind of harmful and causing them a level of issue.
All right, excellent, Kate. Thanks for that. Last couple questions. Osman asks about, kind of what new skills or support systems will ensure our success, and how could we show up differently? And so I think this has been kind of the foundation. We talked about F.E.E.D, we talked about RISE, these different things, but anything else that we haven't already touched on in terms of skills, support systems, or ways that that coaches can bring a different and elevated perspective to what it is they're doing?
I would, again, I have to emphasize this. I will say that this takes a level of accountability, right? And that's self-accountability and managing up with your leaders. And if you look around your department and student service is not something that's being talked about on a daily basis and you would like it to be, make it a part of that conversation, right? Make the suggestion, make the ask. Ask your leader to hold you accountable if you're in this role to student service. And if you're a leader, I know it is so hard. I have had days where I am 100% blocked out by Zoom, but we have encouraged our leadership team, and that's me included and my counterpart included, where we block off time to just review phone calls and just listen to the student experience. And I think when I say that, you got to be very careful about listening for what your coach is offering, and make sure that you save space for listening to the student and what it seems like the student might be experiencing, because those are two very different things. So hopefully between some of the things that we touched on today and that advice, you'll see some level of improvement around what your students are experiencing. And that's the goal.
All right. Excellent. So thanks everybody for these questions. And again, to reiterate what Miranda said, we're going to make this recording available on our Helix Education YouTube channel. And so you can go back and you can revisit all of the great information that Miranda has shared again today. So Donna, thank you for sticking around. We're getting to your question now in terms of resources for coaches for online students and beyond. In addition to coaching, there are many, many resources that Helix Education is making available to colleges and universities to help accelerate their transition to fall 2020. And so Miranda, last few minutes that we have, can you just give a quick overview of what we've made available for folks?
Okay, so we have on our website, we have roles defined. So what you're going to see is that we actually have our student success role. So mainly coaches that are working with students as they move along their degree program. And then we also have roles defined for our enrollment coach, which it does the recruiting, right, and supports students until they get started in classes and usually beyond a bit too. So we have those roles defined. If you are looking at taking a look at how these roles are kind of spun up in your institution, that could be really helpful. We have benchmarks and KPIs available, which show you how we measure different areas of the recruitment funnel and some of the things that kind of go into certain areas and issues and things that we like to cater the student service around to make sure that we reduce our melt. We have trainings and we have a couple of rubrics available that can help you in terms of assessing your student experience across different departments.
Excellent. And so, Miranda, in the time we have left, just where folks can find all this stuff and kind of how this is part of the bigger picture of delivering quality online education.
Absolutely. So as you may have seen, we offer support for online education and 4 unique pillars, which are institutional online readiness, the online teaching and learning experience, the online student experience and engagement, which we're talking about today, and then the student and parent expectation management. So I know many of you have attended our previous webinars, but if this is your first time, we want you to know that we can offer a wide range of resources and can help. Many universities are in a place where they are absolutely trying to desire to get this right, but have concerns that they don't have the time. As one of our participants mentioned, they don't have the experience or the resources, and we've got to get on track for fall. So this is what we bring to the table. As I mentioned, we have guides, rubrics, templates, and resources that can support your online transition and student service. And whether it be for support in the online modality, specifically improving the student experience inside or outside of the classroom and or the messaging to the parents and students, we have specific resources designed to help that. A few more we have aside from the templates and the how-to guides, which I've mentioned. You'll see the benchmarks and KPI documents, and then the assessment rubrics. So hopefully all of those can be helpful to you in this tumultuous time. And you can find all of this at helixeducation.com/new-future, or you can email newfutureinfo@helixeducation.com. And please, please, please be here next week. We have another installment of our student and parent expectation management webinar, which is really going to cover what your institution needs to do next to prepare for fall. So I think that will be a great one to tune in on if you really are looking for what do we need to be thinking of and considering for as we approach our fall term. And with that, I will say thank you so much for attending. I really enjoyed those questions. Hopefully it was really helpful for you. And please reach out if there's any other way that we can support you. And I will turn it back to you, Sparky.
All right, awesome, Miranda. Thanks, and thanks to all of you out there for attending, and especially we appreciate the questions that help make our discussion what it was today. So there's one final reminder to Donna, who asked, and everybody else who didn't ask. The New Future in Higher Education website helixeducation.com/new-future, where you'll have access to a bevy of resources across these 4 pillars, including the one we talked about today, online student experience and engagement. And don't forget to join us next week as we dive deeper into that pillar of student and parent expectation management. And so one last time, thank you, Miranda. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Stay safe, and we will continue to be here to support you in your transition. Take care and have a great rest of your day and week.
Hi, everyone.